This is going to be a wonderful conversation between two brothers, Fred Poole and Henry Poole. And I've often thought in my conversations with Henry Poole how wonderful it would be to be a fly on the wall of their conversations when they were growing up. So we're going to get a little taste of that today. Fred Poole, our first guest and featured speaker, has a Bachelor of Science, a Master's of Social Science, and a PhD, and served as head of the School of Applied Social Science at University College Cork from 1989 to 2014. He was appointed Dean of Social Science at UCC from 2008 to 2014. Born in Dublin, he holds degrees from Trinity College Dublin, the University of Edinburgh, and University College Dublin. Previously, he lectured at the University of Ulster. He's also been an instructor right here in San Diego at UCSD's Extension program and has lectured as well in the UK, Italy, Portugal, China, and France. He has served as the chair of the board for M-Plan and the chair of the Institute of Social Science in the 21st century at UCC. He has also served as chair of MBS in Asian Business, a joint venture between NCC, NTU Singapore, and the Farmley Fellowship from 2010 to 2013, and is UCC's representative on the Irish University Association's Committee on Community Engagement. Our other guest today is his brother, Henry Poole, who, when you're a friend, you have the good fortune of calling him Harry Poole, is Professor Emeritus of Pathology at UC San Diego School of Medicine. He is a graduate of University College Dublin, and his MD and D science degrees are from the National University of Ireland. Professor Poole served as a faculty member at UC San Diego from 1976 to 2005, including serving as the neuropathology division head and as interim chair of pathology. He continues to teach in the School of Medicine. Additionally, Professor Poole served as chair of the UC Academic Senate and also as chair of the UCSD Emeriti Mentor Program. He's an active mentor in the Chancellor Scholars Program. He presently serves as the chair of CUSIA, the Council of UC Emeriti Associations. But we know Professor Poole as a Renaissance man with his wide-flung interests in classical music, international films, and history and culture, current affairs pertaining to England, Ireland, and Brexit. Professor Henry Poole will be hosting his brother and leading the conversation. Harry, welcome.
Thank you.
Fred, welcome. Harry, take it away.
Thank you. It's an extraordinary pleasure to have an opportunity to speak alongside my brother. Fred and I have never stopped talking. As long as we're in the same room and breathing, we're always talking. And a lot of our conversations that are relevant to today started up during the 1960s when we were college students, he at Trinity College, me at UCD. And so during that time, I learned a great deal from him because he came back from the university in the evening, having heard American history, Irish history frequently with the protagonists from major events in Irish history who spoke at his university and addressed his class. So I learned far more than he could have ever learned from me. And we had a wonderful time together until I came over to the United States. Then we continued the conversations. And just yesterday, we were saying that the time when we went to college was a very formative era, a transformative era in Ireland's history, where it started to look at a more positive future. And indeed, the last 100 years in Irish history is hugely interesting, especially as we can see things going on today, things involving Brexit and other situations that draw on the entire history. And so I just want to turn it over to Fred so that he can start talking and I don't monopolize the whole thing.
Well, Harry, you feel free to come in anytime. I'm just going to say a few opening words. The past year has been really significant because the population of the Republic of Ireland has reached 5 million. When my brother left Ireland in 1970, the population was much smaller. In fact, in 1961, it reached its nadir. It was 2.8. Now, there are also 1.9 million people living in Northern Ireland. So that is a figure of 6.9 on the whole island. But in 1845, there were 8.5 million people living on the island of Ireland. 16 million people in Britain. Now there's 66 million in Britain. And yet, I'm so pleased to tell you that there are 5 million in the Republic of Ireland. And the reason I tell you that is that Ireland underwent an enormous crisis, the crisis of the Great Irish Famine between 1845 and 51. And 1 million people died, but many millions subsequently left. Many of them went to the United States. Like now, then people wanted to go to America because they saw it as freedom, not just freedom in terms of liberty, but freedom from hunger. And so many millions of Irish people headed towards America, and I think represent at least 10% of the population and are very significant actors. The current president, Joe Biden, traces his origins from Ireland and indeed is a very proud Irishman. And everybody in Ireland, of course, would have voted for him. So that tells you a little bit about the Irish population. The size of the country is 32,000 square miles, which is the same as the state of Indiana. There are two states, the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is linked to the United Kingdom. And that has its own demographic story because Northern Ireland was set up in 1922 to provide a state for a Protestant majority. We expect in April of next year, when the UK census is announced, that there will be a Catholic majority. That has huge implications for the future of the island because it seems inevitable that it will unify. But most of us would like it to unite in peace. Brexit, as my brother has told you, has been a huge event because being members of the European Union, both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, meant we were in the same super state and there were no borders, just everything dissolved, like history dissolved, and we lived very peacefully. Irish people are very comfortable with ambiguity, and the European Union provided that. The people of Northern Ireland were asked to vote as to whether they wanted to leave the European Union. They rejected it. 56% voted to remain in the European Union. Nonetheless, the UK has moved out. And there is a protocol as a result, which means there is no border in Ireland. And the United Kingdom is having a lot of trouble with this concept at the moment. We live in a cluster of islands, Britain and Ireland, and they all have their own elements and components. There's England, Scotland, Ireland, and England, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. And Brexit is essentially a reassertion of English nationalism, but that has had a knock-on effect on the other components, the other parts of the islands. And the result is a reemergence of nationalism. Of course, it's a time when nationalism is on the march. You've had your own version of it with America first. But with us, it's likely to have fragmentary consequences. Northern Ireland will unify with Ireland. Scotland is likely to leave the United Kingdom. So it's a period of enormous turmoil. Ireland, to summarize its history very briefly, the Republic of Ireland was set up in 1922, initially called the Free State. In 1949, it became the Republic of Ireland. Between 1922 and 1960, it was essentially a theocratic, or certainly a theocentric state. So when I look at Iran sometimes, I think this is like the Ireland that my brother and I experienced in the first decades of our lives, well, the first decade, certainly. 1960 represented a watershed. Ireland embarked on a modernization program. Its great conservative leader, Eamon de Valera, an American, stepped down from the leadership of the country. He became president, but his role was essentially in the background. Economic modernization was built around foreign direct investment. Ireland has one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the world at 12.5% and is under enormous pressure at the moment, particularly from President Biden, to increase its corporate tax rate, and that's likely to happen. But foreign direct investment at one stage meant that half of American investment in Europe was in Ireland. It's still very, very significant, and it has allowed the country to transform itself into one of the richer countries in the world, at least on paper. In 2019, the UN Development Index showed Ireland third in the world. The Development Index looks at the quality of life in terms of education, health, and income. Norway and Switzerland were at the top. Ireland was third. Niger was at the bottom. The UK was in 15th place, and the United States in 16th place. So the money that was invested has had a transformative effect, but also Ireland joined the European Union in 1973, and it poured money into Ireland's development. There were only 15 countries in the EU at the time. Ireland was the poorest and accounted for only 1% of the population. So money was invested in infrastructure and building up the country. So essentially, foreign direct investment, largely American investment, and European investment and European membership have had a transformative effect in my lifetime. Economic modernization had the unintended consequence of bringing about cultural modernization. So we saw the introduction of divorce, contraception, abortion, and same-sex marriage, the disintegration of the power of the Catholic Church, though it still controls approximately 90% of primary schools and a section of the health service, notably through its control of hospitals. And there's a major debate at the moment about the new National Maternity Hospital, which is planned. Will it be controlled by the church? Will it be controlled by the state? It's impossible to agree at the moment, but I don't think the population would accept ownership by anybody other than the state. And that speaks to the transformation of Ireland. The Northern Ireland civil rights movement started in the 1960s and was influenced and shaped by the civil rights movement in the United States. It led to a rejection of the Northern Ireland state by Catholics and 30 years of civil war. In 1998, the Belfast Agreement brought about a settlement. Senator George Mitchell from the United States was the chair of those talks, and his wisdom and political genius brought about essentially a post-nationalist settlement. I think that that post-nationalist settlement may contain the seeds of a political solution to Ireland's current circumstances, and that will be George Mitchell's legacy. Finally, can I just say that migration, which I've already adverted to, is a huge part of the Irish story. The Great Famine resulted not just in 1 million people dying, but many more millions emigrating. And so an Irish diaspora occurred across the world. And it's particularly concentrated in the United States, but there are Irish in very large numbers in Australia and Canada. And of course, there are Irish in the United Kingdom. That, in a nutshell, is our history. And I'll stop there because I know my brother will want to comment and want to open up the discussion. Harry.
So maybe you could say something about how Ireland is happier to be in the European Union, and why would one island speaking English want to be in the Union, and the other island, the larger island, also speaking English, would reject it so forcefully?
It's a paradox. I think, as I've already said, there is a recrudescence of English nationalism. And I think they are looking back to the days of empire. And leaving Europe was, for the United Kingdom, a counterintuitive step. The EU only exports 8% of its goods to the United Kingdom, but the United Kingdom sells almost 50%, 47% of its goods to the European Union. Yet it's embarking on putting up trade barriers and introducing tariffs, which would seem to be illogical. Ireland, because it has benefited so much from being in the European Union, materially, culturally, and socially wants to remain. And I think it's to do with identity.
Mm.
We want to be Europeans. We're very, very proud of being Europeans. And a recent opinion poll indicated 92% of the population supported membership of the European Union. It also differentiates us from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom has believed in global Britain and rekindling its relationship with other English-speaking cultures, notably the United States. But when the British Prime Minister visited Washington in the last few weeks, hoping for a trade deal, he was told that the United States isn't doing trade deals these days. And that, I think, was a polite rejection of his plans. And so for us in Ireland, we look somewhat askance at our neighbors in Britain and wonder why they did this. And I think it's because they are in a crisis, a post-imperial crisis of identity. They don't know where they're going. And some politicians, including led by Boris Johnson, got together and persuaded them to leave the European Union, that it was responsible for all their ills. The truth is that their ills and difficulties are the result of much more complex historical and geopolitical events. And it's sad to have seen that decision, though not entirely surprising, because the United Kingdom, well, particularly Britain, or particularly England, was not comfortable in the European, visibly not comfortable in the European Union, whereas Scotland was very comfortable in the European Union. And once a vote on becoming independent, and that independence envisages rejoining the European Union, and like Ireland, becoming a European state, because that creates, a bit like the United States, it creates a much larger framework where diverse groups and cultures can intermingle and mix and create something larger through the cooperation between all those states. So that really is, I think for Ireland, Europe has been very positive. I think for England, it has not been a positive experience because their history is different. They've looked outward to the world and they look back at that and say, well, you know, we're just one cog in a European quasi-federal system.
Fred, may I jump in?
Yep.
Yes, so I think in England, the leadership really sold to the people that immigration was, you know, the root of all evil in England. Ireland didn't see immigration as a problem?
That's right, Suzanne. Ireland didn't see immigration as a problem. Ireland saw it as very helpful in terms of growing the population, but in an economy that was growing and flourishing, we needed to attract foreign labor. And part of the European arrangement is the free movement of labor. So people can move around Europe and work wherever they want. And that's been very, very important because Eastern Europe has provided a large number of well-educated and very able workers for Ireland. And we have really valued them. And they have become part of our society. So instead of having outward migration, immigration, we now have inward migration. And that is something to celebrate. And it also creates, of course, greater diversity, which is very healthy in any society. I mean, the United States is such an extraordinary society because the creativity created by diversity has just made it a place where everybody wants to be and the most talented people want to go to. So we have had on a micro scale, we've had a similar experience.
So Fred, could you say a little bit about Michael D. Higgins?
Yes, Michael D. Higgins is the president of Ireland. Now, the president of Ireland is different to the United States because we have a parliamentary system. So we have a prime minister known as the Taoiseach, and the prime minister is the head of the government, but the president is head of the state and guardian of the constitution. And so when we have elections for president, we look at the individuals and their suitability for the office. And it's a very important office symbolically as well as constitutionally. For example, in 1990, we elected a woman for the first time, Mary Robinson, who went on to be UN Commissioner for Human Rights. She was followed by another woman who had 2 terms, and the presidential terms in Ireland are 7 years. After she stood down, having completed 14 years, an election took place, and a candidate emerged who had been on the political left, but a man of extraordinary culture, a poet, a writer, an intellectual, an academic, part of teaching in Galway in the social sciences, which is part of the National University of Ireland, which includes UCC. And he captured the imagination of the Irish population because he was so articulate, so intelligent, that people felt this is somebody who can represent us across the world, but also somebody who can be our leader in a way that the head of government isn't. And a recent opinion poll showed that 81% of the population regarded Michael D. Higgins, the president, who's now in his 2nd term, as the outstanding political leader in the country. And this was tested recently when he was invited to a celebration of partition, of the creation of the Northern Ireland state 100 years ago in 1921. And he refused to attend. This seemed a very, very tough decision, but he looked at the future and he felt celebrating this past, where there was a great deal of discrimination and a great deal of unhappiness, for him to endorse that would not be appropriate. And the people overwhelmingly supported him. He is a truly remarkable human being and an inspiration to the population. And we hold him in extraordinary regard. He's a kind of spiritual leader. And when he speaks, and I've heard him speak many times, the words that flow from his mouth are ones of such intelligence and insight and wisdom that people just sit there thinking, this is the best speech I've ever heard in my life. And of course, in Ireland, giving a good speech is everything. And if you can write poetry as well, that really matters. As you know, many of your politicians do occasionally quote poets, notably Joe Biden recently in relation to Seamus Heaney's line about rhyming hope and history. And in a sense, that poetic expression of leadership is what Michael D. Higgins achieves and exudes. And wherever he goes, he just makes an extraordinary impact because of his erudition and knowledge and just enthusiasm, which is quite palpable.
So, Fred, could you say something about the border in the sea, the border that goes between England and Ireland, and is a line drawn in the Irish Sea at the moment?
This is complex, but basically when two states were created in Ireland, there was a border. And that border had customs posts, and from the beginning of the Troubles in the 1960s, there were large military installations. I worked in the University of Ulster, as Suzanne mentioned, and I lived north of Northern Ireland. That may seem like a contradiction in terms, but I lived on a peninsula called Inishowen. And every day I would drive across the border with my large black dog. And my car was never searched because the dog looked fierce, even though she had a heart of gold. And though once she was threatened with being shot, but happily it didn't happen. And so you went through customs, two sets of customs, and you went through a military checkpoint. And that was something that Irish people were afraid of. You actually get quite used to it. You learn how not to antagonize the soldiers, and you get through peacefully. You try not to drive late at night because that's dangerous. People are trigger happy. But the feeling was that this was an unacceptable imposition. And so when we joined the European Union, the customs disappeared. There were no more customs. There were no more checks on any economic activity. And after the peace agreement in 1998, the military checkpoints, often in the form of huge, of fortified buildings anyway, they were removed. And so with Brexit, we were now confronted with having to go back to that, to customs, to military checkpoints, and probably to a reemergence of political violence, because the feeling was if a customs post was put up, that it wouldn't last very long, that people who were opposed would destroy it. And so when Brexit occurred, there was a very long negotiation about the terms of the agreement. And eventually, there was a protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which guaranteed there would be no physical border on the island of Ireland. Now, in order to facilitate this, the European Union said that while Britain was leaving the European Union, Northern Ireland could, for economic purposes, remain within the European Union. And it would form a common economic area with the Republic of Ireland. This, of course, is perceived as a major step towards Irish reunification. And consequently, the British government, who signed off on the agreement and knew fully what it meant, are now seeking to renegotiate and threatening to revoke the agreement. And I don't think they will, because I don't think it's politically feasible. And President Biden and the US Congress, both Democrat and Republican, have said they would not be happy if that happened. They've told the British that they believe that the Belfast Agreement must be upheld, but also there cannot be a restoration of a border on the island of Ireland. The negotiations continue, and it's partly in the interests of the British government to the UK government to play on English nationalist sentiment, though it's very, very dangerous because it could set off a new war in Northern Ireland. Our hope is that it will be resolved. Well, it was resolved by the protocol, which was the solution, but now the solution is being resisted. And I think it's important to say that Ulster Unionists, because in Northern Ireland, the population is divided between Unionists, who are people who were planted in Northern Ireland, and the Nationalists, who were people indigenous to Northern Ireland. The Unionists don't want the protocol because they see economic unification of the island really as a first major step towards political unification. So they're very unhappy at the moment. And they supported Brexit, not realizing that the British at the last minute would agree to this protocol. And they feel sold down the river, so they're very angry. And they're very concerned about their future. What would it be like for them in a united Ireland? Now, there used to be a problem that Ian Paisley, which you've probably seen on your screens, now long dead, but Ian Paisley was a great orator, a clergyman, trained at Bob Jones University in the United States, an evangelical university. He inflamed Protestant unionist opinion, which is essentially like the fundamentalist population in the United States. And they became existentially very concerned about their future because they feel that they're going to be part of a nationalist island of Ireland, and they will have to coexist, or some of them fear they'll have to leave, and or some of them think they should fight. And that really puts enormous pressure on politicians in Ireland, in Washington, and in the European Union, and of course the United Kingdom, to come up with further solutions that somehow can create a resolution to Ireland's problems that will be peaceful, will be consensual, which are the principles of the Belfast Agreement, and that probably will be post-nationalist. It will be something where everybody can hold on to their identity. And that was part of the genius of the Belfast Agreement. You could be Irish, or you could be British on the island of Ireland. You could be Chinese, you could be anything. You could be a myriad of these things. You know, you can be Irish, British, British Irish, Scottish Irish, Chinese Irish, African Irish. All of these identities need, in the spirit of the Belfast Agreement, to be equally valued. And that is fundamental to any peaceful progress and ultimate resolution of the issues on the island. It used to be a concern that the Catholic Church had great power, but following the child abuse scandals in Ireland, its power just collapsed overnight. And
Fred, may I jump in?
Sorry?
May I jump in? We've got
Please,
a question.
Suzanne.
Yes, and it is open to all to raise your hand and ask a question. We have a question from Peter Gorovich. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted you to say more about what you've just been talking about. Thank you very much for your comments. They're very fascinating. I just would like you to say more about what kind of a solution you see to the North Ireland question. I just wanted you to continue on this idea of multiple identities. We have that problem all over Europe, all in the United States, all over the global problem. But I wonder, would you speculate some more on what you think are the political foundations of some of the solutions? What do you see the political prospects for some? I take it you don't think that the political prospects of a unified Ireland are there, that there's some kind of, I hear you saying that some sort of a compromise will be necessary where Ireland, Northern Ireland continues to have some autonomy because people in the North want to maintain a separate identity of some kind. Is that where you're headed? Is that what you're saying?
I think that is a distinct possibility, but Northern Ireland was set up on the basis that there would be a Protestant majority. It was a state created by the British for a Protestant majority.
Right.
But as I mentioned earlier,
would you say more about that? You said that it's not going to change. Say more about the consequences of a Catholic majority.
Well, I think the consequences are quite stark, because under the terms of the Belfast Agreement, 50% of the vote plus one creates a united Ireland. And if you have a Catholic majority, then logically that will happen. But it's not that simple. One, there are the two tribes, if you like, Unionist and Nationalist, Protestant and Catholic. But there's also an in-between group of about 20. And they support a cross-community party called the Alliance. And they also vote for some smaller parties like the Greens. That group may have the determining say in what actually happens. And they are led by a very, very effective leader at the moment, who I think would be a key actor in imagining a future which would be flexible enough to allow these identities to coexist and to be respected. I think that is a distinct possibility. Now, there's another element to this equation, because if you were to have a united Ireland, there would have to be a majority voting for it in Northern Ireland, but also a majority voting for it in the Republic of Ireland. And the costs would be huge of absorbing Northern Ireland. If you take German unification, Germany's a really powerful country, but when it absorbed East Germany, the costs were colossal, and it created huge challenges. Now, Ireland would face, obviously on a more micro scale, but it would face exactly the same problems. And indeed in Germany, they are still working on lifting the standard of East Germany, the standard of living, but also reconciling the two populations. West German identity is still much more prestigious than East German identity. So there are enormous problems in trying to reach a consensus in two different states with different populations, and a further link to Britain and a need to somehow reconcile all these competing identities and a very complex historical legacy that stretches all over the world, where people have views. Apparently, President Biden was perfectly sanguine about having a vote on a united Ireland. And the Republic apparently said to him, hold on, we're not ready for that. That's because unraveling these complex questions of identity and culture and history are not easy. The Belfast Agreement was the first step, but it's, I think, put in place a post-nationalist solution, but it will need an equally clever set of arrangements to, I think, bring about a peaceful unification of Ireland. The one, I think, really positive element in the situation is that, of course, the Republic of Ireland is part of the European Union, and Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union. And I think European structures and European support could be very, very important in terms of reaching a solution. And it's important to say that I don't have a passport in my hand, but our passport says European Union. And then there's Ireland underneath, or France, or England, or whatever. But there is this overarching structure that itself is really a post-nationalist structure based on legal and constitutional norms. It's not a federal state, it's something else. And I think that Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and the island of Ireland need to achieve something else. And we're not there yet. We can't quite see it.
Thanks.
And so there needs to be a lot of discussion, because only in dialogue can one achieve consensus. The alternative is violence.
And in Britain, in England, is there in Parliament, London Parliament, is there a majority to letting Northern Ireland become part of Ireland?
No, there's not. For them, it's completely off the agenda.
Off the agenda, okay.
And for a vote to take place, the British Secretary of State for Northern Ireland would have to trigger it. They would have to agree. And the terms of the Belfast Agreement say, when the conditions are right in the judgment of the British Secretary of State. So that is a major stumbling block, potentially in the future. But I imagine if international pressure built up, and particularly if there was support from Washington, then a more flexible position might be taken. But at the moment, the British would take the view that the conditions aren't there. And that is another element in the equation that's going to have to be sorted out. And particularly with a very nationalist-minded government at Westminster, that's going to be difficult.
Now, the Conservative Party right now is very nationalist. Would Labour be just as difficult? Would a Labour Party in Westminster be just as difficult or not?
They wouldn't be. And Tony Blair, who is the leader of the Labour Party, he was instrumental with Bill Clinton, George Mitchell, and Bertie Ahern in bringing about the Belfast Agreement. They would be much less nationalistic, much less ideological, but at the moment, they're supporting the Conservative stance that this is not, a United Ireland is not something they want to, a discussion they want to get into.
So does the Conservative Party in Westminster still call itself conservative and unionist? And does it still call itself that? And unionist meant unionist of Northern Ireland?
I think possibly it formally does, but it doesn't really make a great deal of sense anymore. And so it's not mentioned. No decisions have been made, but it's simply not mentioned.
Okay.
It's not part of the discussion. But you can see that the union, and I mean the union in terms of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, is important to English people. But unfortunately, in wanting to leave the European Union, they have created a situation where their nationalism has set off nationalism on all the other component parts. Wales is the least nationalist part of, well, it's less nationalist, obviously, than Northern Ireland or Scotland. And that, I think, reflects the fact that its act of union took place in the 16th century. So it's very integrated with England. But there are some signs of a kind of a recrudescence of Welsh nationalism as well. So things are very fraught at the moment. And the politicians of Westminster are very committed to trying to hold the line, to try and keep the union together, because if the union starts to fragment, then that is something that they understandably would see as very negative.
Bob Knox, go ahead.
Yeah, in light of the tangled connections in the whole Northern Ireland situation and perhaps unintended consequences for England and Westminster flowing out of Brexit and so on and so forth, is there any chance that the English slash Westminster are going at some point in the future to say, oops, we made a mistake, let's see if we can rejoin the Union, the European Union?
I think that must be on the agenda. Things are getting very difficult in the UK at the moment. You've probably seen there are food shortages, there are what you'd call gas shortages, and there's shortages of labour. For example, the Conservative Party are holding their annual conference in Manchester at the moment, and pig farmers are outside demonstrating because there are not enough butchers to man the abattoirs and kill the pigs. So they're going to have to put them down on their farms. And they're very angry about this. So this is a foretaste of what may become much more difficult in January when the European Union starts imposing rigorous tariffs on British goods and enforcing the Brexit agreement. I think if the British economy goes into decline, and there are considerable signs that this may be happening, that the population may see Brexit as a mistake. And an opinion poll in the past week showed that 53% of the population see Brexit as going, quote, badly. Only 4% see it as going well, very well, I should say. And so it's a policy that's worked politically for the Conservative Party, but the economic consequences may be much more difficult. And if the public mood changes, and it hasn't changed in terms of political affiliations, the Conservative Party is still 4 points ahead of Labour at the moment in the opinion polls, and that's from yesterday. If that holds, obviously Brexit holds, but on the other hand, if the Labour Party were to get the upper hand and replace the Conservatives, it's got a leader who is very, very anti-Brexit. And he's been afraid to speak out, but people are saying as the mood changes, or at least as the reality changes, then he may find his voice. And we may see a rethink. Of course, the Europeans may not be keen on having somebody back as a nation, back as a member who left. I mean, it's been like a divorce. And so there's all the emotional stuff. And that's where it's at. But I think it's a possibility, yes.
Mm-hmm. So, Fred, or people from UCSD might be visiting Ireland. Do you have any recommendations for people who are visiting Ireland of places to see and cities and parts of the country to visit?
Well, obviously, Dublin is the capital, and there are some wonderful historic buildings. But the west of Ireland is remote, desolate, but extraordinarily beautiful. And going there, I would strongly recommend. There's a wonderful hotel and you might email it to people, called Ballynahinch Castle.
Oh, yes.
And it would be a wonderful place to stay. I've stayed there a couple of times, and I've always meant to take my brother, but we never have enough time to get there. But Connemara is the name for the area, and it means Sea of Rocks. And it's a place of just extraordinary lyrical beauty.
Yes.
That is so embedded in history, but the landscape somehow seems to merge with the history and the story in some kind of poetic form. And so when you're there, you feel like you've been transported into another world. So I would recommend that. And of course, having lived in Cork for many decades, I would have to recommend West Cork, but also Cork City, which is the food capital of Ireland. And so I would encourage you to go there. One of the wonderful things about Ireland, apart from the poetry, is the music. And I'd really encourage you to enjoy that.
Fred, going back to political economy, you spoke at the beginning about the 15% corporate rate and how that drew quite a number of major international corporations, American corporations, and helped to develop Ireland. But how is Ireland looking at that now? With these issues of the Pandora Papers coming out, the great concentration of wealth and hiding of wealth, is there not a feeling of wanting to reevaluate that 15% corporate rate so that more of the benefits of that corporate development flows to the people?
I agree with you, Suzanne. It's actually 12.5% at the moment, but the proposal is to raise it to 15%. I think the fear the Irish government has is they will be forced perhaps to raise it to 20%. And that could undermine foreign direct investment as they see it. I don't think it will, but what you're really referring to is Ireland's tax haven status, as some people call it. And I think there is a lot of truth in that. And I think that's bad for Ireland. It's bad, as Paul Krugman has pointed out, it's bad for international relations because having this really low corporate tax rate may hurt neighbors or it may hurt developing countries. And so it's not something that I personally support. And I think that it's time that Ireland looked at that policy and changed it. And I think it's going to, because it has to. And I think a decision on that is imminent. But you're absolutely right. You have your finger on the button, Suzanne. This really is not a very healthy or ethical arrangement because it means that money, dark money, is being hosted in Ireland. Now, that's nothing to do with the multinationals, but Ireland is also a center for international capital and speculation. And that is always worrying because one is concerned that the ethics of the casino do not become the ethics of a nation. And it's important that we avoid that. And I think we may be on the way to do that, but it remains to be seen.
Thank you.
So,
are there any other questions from members? Go ahead,
One
Harry.
footnote.
Go ahead, Fred.
One footnote to Suzanne's question is that it was announced that the GDP growth was 15.6%. Now, that's the impact of these policies. And of course, it's what Joseph Stiglitz has called leprechaun economics. It makes no sense. I mean, even the Chinese don't have growth rates of 15.6%. And when that was announced on television, it was pointed out the government wouldn't be spending any more money. Well, the reason it wouldn't be spending any more money is because the corporate tax rate is so low. It wouldn't be a revenue generating statistic. It was, in a sense, a false piece of news. And what Donald Trump would call fake news, I don't think that was the intention, but the statistics are certainly somewhat skewed by
Fred, allow me to follow up on that. In the United States, the Republicans, championed at the time by Ronald Reagan, used to ballyhoo trickle-down economics, that if only we could unleash corporate growth, all of the benefits from that would flow to the lower classes. Are we seeing that in Ireland?
No, I don't think so. I mean, during the crash, and the Irish economy crashed in 2008, and the period between 2008 and 2013 were periods of intense hardship in Ireland. And the Central Statistics Office in a report pointed out, without income transfers or social transfers through the welfare system, up to half the population were at risk of falling into poverty. Now, in a country that regards itself as affluent and developed, that is a very, very troubling statistic. And Ireland doesn't have a welfare state in the European sense of the term. Ireland is more a competition state. It used to call itself the Celtic Tiger, and the reference there was to Asia. So its social policies are very much productivist social policies led by education and upskilling the labor force, but often at the expense of people who are marginalized by poverty, who can't share in that wealth and can't share in the society at large. And that is hugely problematic. We see it in the price of property at the moment, lack of investment in a universal healthcare system, which is causing major political divisions.
Thank you, Fred. Question from Peter?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize points that Fred just made at the end there. About 20 years ago, I did a project with some colleagues. We were studying the hard disk drive and globalization, where it was being located. And Ireland and Singapore were two of the interesting centers of where hard disk drive assembly was being located. And we were studying why it was happening. And I was assigned to go to Ireland, which was a lot of fun. And I want to score that Western Ireland is as beautiful as Fred said. I remember being struck by that. And also, but I also thought, going along the coast there, I was struck by the beauty, but I also saw that it was a harsh way to make a living. All those rocks meant that it was not easy to farm. I could see why people left. But the point I wanted to make was, it's not just trickled down. It's not just that they had a low tax rate, but they invested a lot in education. The point that Fred made, why did people locate there? They located there because they spoke English, which made them, you could make them easily part of the value chain. So the country was, and they were investing a lot in education. And the European Union was investing a lot in infrastructure all over the place. There were signs about roads and industrial parks and things being built by European Union money. So there was a lot of public investment going on. I mean, it was a lot like California. California spends a lot of money on education and a lot of money in public infrastructure. And that's why that we have high-tech growth here. And so it is exactly a challenge in upskilling. The interesting contrast on a side point in our particular industry, the difference between the Industrial Development Center that I interviewed people with in Ireland versus Singapore is that in Singapore actually was picking industries to focus on, such as hard disk drive. They deliberately went after to get the hard disk drive to go to Singapore, whereas the strategy of the Irish Development Agency was not to pick specific industries. They wanted to make things attractive and let the industries themselves decide which ones wanted to go there. But all the points that Fred was just making were very clear there, that they were investing in skills to attract business, but they weren't investing in the social infrastructure of exactly the debate which is going on in Congress today. How much do you have to invest in education and other things? How much of that is really part of the industrial system to make it all work? So it's not just equity. It's not just a matter of equality. It's also a matter of what do you mean by making the system work? Is people's health a part of of an effective economy? The number of days that you lose not going to work, isn't that part of economic efficiency? But I just want to emphasize the point that Ireland also benefited from a lot of money, a lot of investment that wasn't just lower taxes for the business. The government was putting lots of money into education, and the European Union was putting lots of money into infrastructure. So there was a lot of public money being spent creating the conditions that made it possible for low taxes to make a difference. I just want to emphasize Fred's point. That's
Well said. I completely agree.
I remember that the day I was there, I was taken to dinner in Dublin by these fellas from the Irish Development Council. I don't remember exactly its name, and it would happen to be the day on which it was announced in the newspaper that Irish per capita income had that week gone over British per capita income for the first time in history. And I earned myself a free meal because I said, gentlemen, I just read this in the newspaper, and I think that's such a historically important and interesting thing that I would like to lift a glass of wine and celebrate that extraordinary accomplishment of which you are partially responsible. So congratulations to you. And the smile on their faces was so phenomenal. They were so happy that I was celebrating Irish defeat of Britain on that, because that really was a historically, when you think about the comparison of the two countries, all the disregard that the British heaped upon Ireland, and at that particular historical moment, Ireland's per capita income was now exceeding that of the Great Britain. That was kind of England. I can't remember whether it was Great Britain or England. I think it might have been England. That's an extraordinary moment. I try to think of when that was. I would say that was 20 years ago. So they paid for my dinner.
Well, Fred mentioned the hotel in the west of Ireland, Ballinahinch, and that was owned by a man who was called Humanity Dick. And the name Humanity Dick was actually from the King of England, from George IV, was ridiculing Humanity Dick because he was the man who sponsored legislation saying you could no longer be cruel to animals, that animals had rights and animals should be treated with respect. And so he was Humanity Dick.
A forward-looking person.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, last chance, everybody. Otherwise, we would like to thank you, Fred, for beaming in to us from Ireland. This was absolutely lovely. Really, really nice to have this discussion. And so I wasn't able to go back and be a fly on the wall of your living room or dining room when the two of you were growing up, but it was wonderful to hear you now. Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Take care. Be well.